Hey, Mr. Smith, your audio, we hear you and all, but it's coming through like echoey. It's not normal.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
on campus today,
Oh, okay, okay.
so I'm on my laptop. I'm not on my usual mic. All right, is that better?
It's about the same, I'd say, but it's understandable.
Yeah. So I'm on laptop mic. That's the difference. So as far as things we talked about doing yesterday, we got you set up with Firebase, so we've taken care of that. So everybody should have their project created and got started on their Android Studio project as well, and getting those things hooked together. Two things I remember I asked you to do yesterday. One of those was to watch through the Ultimate Beginner's Guide, and it looks like most people have done that. I saw a lot of comments, and I'll be going through some of those here. And I also remember asked you to look at the Notepad example app. Okay, so hopefully you've had some kind of intro and looked at that and seen, okay, how do I write that code, played around with it a little bit. But we'll be going through that today and kind of talking about, what does it look like to use Firebase from Android is kind of our goal today. As far as assignments to do once we finish the kind of lecture portion of this section today, there's a series of videos on Perusal for you to watch as well today. So if you go looking through there, you'll see that there's one about data modeling, and there's a series of videos here from this one's still from Fireship. These are actually from the Firebase. These are official videos from Firebase talking about a variety of things that you should kind of know about as you get started with Firebase. It's not the whole series, so you can see there's some gaps. I put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 9. I think it's a series of like 12 videos if I remember right. But those are the ones that I picked out. It's like, oh, this is really useful information as you're getting started out. It's probably one of the better summaries of those different pieces of information. All of these videos here are actually language agnostic, so they're not really going to get into how you do things specifically in Java or JavaScript, but it's going to talk about the framework in general. Okay?
Yep.
So those are things I want you to watch once we get done with this, as well as then continuing to jump into your final project and starting to work Firebase together with the project you're building. Cool. All right, so let's talk through some of the questions that were raised on the video. I'll just kind of go from the beginning of the video on, and we can kind of look at these one by one. So Sheridan, you'd asked, do the credentials have any meaning, or are they just an ID that allows you to find it? And if we look at what's in here, if we look at what's on the screen, we can see there's an API key, we can see there's an auth domain, the database URL, storage bucket, all this stuff. Basically, all of that is random numbers. So those are random numbers that, yeah, you need them as credentials to connect, but for all intents and purposes, you can treat them as random. Cool. They're kind of, maybe you think about it a little bit as like a user ID or something. It's not really private information, but it is information that you need to be able to connect. Paul, you'd asked about, hey, what are some, similarities, Mongo, Firebase, and I think I talked about some of that yesterday. And yeah, I think you could consider MongoDB and Firebase as competitors in the NoSQL world, because yeah, they provide a NoSQL database, and those are those are interchangeable. You can use Firebase or you can use Mongo to do a lot of the same things. There's things that obviously MongoDB does better, and there are things that Firebase does better. So it's really a case of figuring out what fits best to what you're building. And so for web applications and REST APIs, Mongo is amazing. But if you're trying to build just a mobile app, whether it be for iOS or Android, without building out your own backend, then Firebase is a really good option. Does that follow?
Okay.
So if you have room for two teams and you really need the maximum performance out of your backend and the maximum flexibility and the maximum control over that backend, then Mongo is great. And in reality, you also probably end up spending less per month using Mongo, building your own system as far as maintenance costs are concerned. That being said, you still have to count the developer hours. So more than likely with the developer hours, if you were trying to build the same thing that Firebase supports, it probably would end up costing you more for Mongo to roll it all yourself. So there's kind of a trade-off in cost there. It may be cheaper. It may be cheaper to go one way. It might be cheaper to go the other way. I would say that price is probably not the best determining factor, though. In that, it's more of where do you want to spend your time. Cool. That will be, choosing MongoDB, choosing Firebase. It's a good thing to know about some of the differences there. In reality, as entry-level developers, you probably will not be making that decision. It'll probably be somebody higher up, and it usually ends up being the business that makes, unfortunately, those technology decisions, not the developers themselves, unfortunately. Even though hopefully we have a chance to give our advice. Does that serve to answer what you had asked, Paul?
Yeah, I just see them being very similar with the object IDs, and it's in the cloud, and it doesn't use that SQL language. And
correct.
Seeing other stuff with how it was brought in with Node, it just made me think of Mongo, what we did last semester.
Yeah, it's in a lot of ways very, very similar. I think there's a little brief discussion here about using Firebase with VS Code and basically, hey, web apps today, he's writing this in JavaScript. If you're writing programs in vanilla JavaScript, if you're writing things with Node, which he kind of is here too, VS Code has been really the go-to for web applications, especially using Node. So it's when you're talking about your database, well, your database is going to work with whatever IDE you use, right? So your IDE you usually pick on based on what your front end technology is. Your mix of back end and front end technologies. So like if we're building Android, well, we're going to use Android Studio, and we'll take whatever database we fit, and we'll make it work with that. So you choose your IDE. You choose your technologies, you choose your IDE, and your database really just has to work with those previous choices. So.
Why, just an overall question about strategy, not related to the class, but the IDEs, we use Visual Studio Code. We got Android Studio now. Visual Studio Code does a lot of stuff, and it seems like they would try to replace all of them, to be everything, because maybe that's a bridge too far.
Yeah, it isn't. In some sense, VS Code does a lot, and in some sense, yes. In some sense, VS Code does a lot, but in some sense, it actually doesn't do much. So really, VS Code is actually pretty bare bones out of the box. I mean, VS Code, if you look at it without any plugins installed, it's actually not much more than a text editor, right? VS Code without plugins is not actually that much higher in complexity or higher in things than Notepad++. Yes, it's got the terminal built in, which is great, and it's got the Explorer built in, which Notepad doesn't. But it's really, a lot of people consider VS Code still to be a text editor in the same way as like Notepad. And they're kind of true because it's of its lightweight. The strength has been, once you start adding extensions, plugins to VS Code, it can do an awful lot of things, right? And work for an awful lot of different technologies. The gotcha is specifically for the Android world. Well, Android is very full of Androidisms and Android special needs. So I think that even no matter how many plugins that you were to add to VS Code, I really don't think that it would provide a great experience for working with Android apps.
Okay. All right.
Like, you probably could do it with enough plugins. With the right plugins, you could probably write Android apps in VS Code, but I don't know that I would want to. And it just comes down to all of the stuff that Android Studio does provide, whether it be from the designer, the graphic UI designer, to the emulators, to the logcat, to debugging. All of those things are built in. Those are things that would have to be provided somehow as plugins in VS Code. Does that kind of follow?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you can use other things. It's like using a garden shovel to serve your mashed potatoes. It'll work, but it's not really intended for it.
And to give you a little bit of history, Android Studio is kind of a new tool to the game, because actually originally, and this is where I was doing stuff professionally with Android, I was actually using Eclipse, because Eclipse used to be the standard IDE that you would use to do Android development several years ago. And that was like, if you went to go to the page that is now where you download Android Studio, used to be the page where you download Eclipse and the Eclipse plugins. And Eclipse is an IDE in a lot of ways, similar to VS Code. Eclipse does not provide a lot of stuff out of the box. And is meant to add a bunch of plugins to make it work for your specific technology. So Eclipse is also kind of one of those tools that you can use to write almost any language, similar to VS Code. I think that, hands down, VS Code is a much better IDE out of the box than Eclipse is. Eclipse has a lot of weirdness and a lot of complexity to it and things, and part of that is probably due to actually being implemented in Java itself and targeting Java, but that actually used to be what we did. We used to have Eclipse and put plugins into Eclipse, and it actually didn't work that great from my experience doing that. Android Studio is a lot easier to work with than Eclipse was. So my overall experience has been it's usually a better experience. It's better to take an IDE that's really designed to work with the technology specifically that you're using, rather than trying to take a generic IDE and stuff all the stuff in as plugins.
Did you find when you worked in industry that you would have to shift between different editors just to get the job done? Because if I had to go back to Node, I would need a few hours just to learn VS Code, because I wouldn't even know how to change
Absolutely. And I still do it. I still do it to this day. That is a very, very common thing. So when I was working in industry and doing Android development, I would use Eclipse for my quote unquote for my Android development. That's what we were using. That was our IDE. But on the we also had a website, a web app that we were developing in tandem with that. So that was in VS Code. Not VS Code, Visual Studio. So I regularly had Visual Studio and Eclipse running at the same time, because I was doing things that were cross between the web application and the and the Android application. So you have Eclipse for Android, you have Visual Studio for the web application. We actually had a few different web applications, and as things happen, Microsoft puts out new versions of their IDEs. So I actually, at one point, I think I had Visual Studio 2008 and 2010 because some of our projects needed 2008 and some of our projects needed 2010. So I had, two different IDEs there because those are actually different IDEs. Plus, you pull up Notepad every once in a while to do things that you don't want a full Notepad++ to do things that you don't want a full IDE for. Those things still exist. So it's not unusual in industry to be using 3 different IDEs on the regular. That happens a lot. That's not, I would say that using 3 different IDEs and even using them simultaneously is not uncommon. So there's that side of things. I've had a hobby project that I've worked on as well this semester, off and on, and we were building a game in Unity. Well, we're using Unity as one editor. I was writing my code in IntelliJ, a version of IntelliJ for Unity, but I was also writing the backend code in VS Code. So again, three different IDEs.
Yeah, you got to be bilingual.
Yeah, you really have to be bilingual in this industry. It's really hard to build an application all in one language. Oh, and I didn't mention in that, in addition to Eclipse and Visual Studio, I also had to do database things. So, I had a management studio, a SQL Server management studio, because we were doing stuff with SQL Server. So I had an IDE for SQL there, but I also had an IDE, basically another tool that we use, SQLite, I think it was personal, professional, but we had a SQLite, SQLite Expert. So we had another tool that I would also use for the database on the device, right? So that's, just counting the technologies of the application doesn't count the additional, hey, you may have another tool or two to manage the database, like Compass you use for Mongo and things like that. Yeah, so bilingual is really a thing you have to just kind of get used to, because you will find yourself writing more than one language and using more than one IDE. That's almost guaranteed. The one catch there is actually with web apps, disregarding other things like desktop applications and such. Actually, most web applications, you can pretty much build the entire thing in VS Code, which has actually been phenomenal. Because, yeah, the norm is having a bunch of different things, and those things are very heavy. VS Code is very light, and yeah, so if you're using VS Code, you may actually be able to get away with not having another editor, but it's unlikely.
All right, tangent alert.
Yeah. Sorry, tangent alert.
Yeah.
But it's important things to understand from the industry. That's just going to be your norm. Is having 2 or 3 different IDEs up is not a weird thing. Yeah. Question was about are we going to do some setup like this with the Firebase JSON, Firebase RC, that kind of project stuff. We won't be doing as what's shown there, because that's how you do stuff for a web app, static web app, and we're building an Android, so that won't apply. One question was asked about these scripts that we're importing, and I think that in the video he said that you can cut out the modules that you're not using. So for instance, if you're not using the storage system, well, you don't need to import the storage system. If you're not using messaging, you don't need to import messaging. And part of the reason, I think what was said there is that would affect your page load times, right? So how long does your page take to load depends on what all it needs to get the page up and running, right? Well, one of the more details in that in the web world, right? Let's say I'm downloading these 4 scripts. Does it take the same time? Does having those 4 scripts make every page I go to slower? Or does it make the first page slower?
I would think that because you're deferring it, that you would have your user look at something and they probably wouldn't notice unless they click on something immediately as soon as the page loads.
So the defer keyword, remember, just says go ahead and start downloading it, but don't run this script until the DOM is fully loaded. So the thing to understand, a lot of times when you're thinking about how performance works in the web, actually most of the time in terms of scripts is purely in the time to just download it from the internet. And that might seem like, hey, it's a tiny text file and that should be almost immediate, and we have fast internet, but that actually is one of the bigger blocking points. It still takes time to process the JavaScript code and to actually execute it, but more often than not, the slowest part is actually downloading it. And because of that, let's say I have 4 scripts I'm downloading, I have here, versus 2 scripts I'm downloading. More than likely, the only case I'm going to see a difference between 2 and 4 is just on the first time I visit that website, the first page I go to, because from there it will already have been downloaded. Okay. So in the end, it usually does, like the difference in load experience isn't usually that important. It's actually more important in terms of search engine optimization, because Google just does care how fast that first page loads. So there's some scoring in there that matters for how fast that page loads, which is why people spend a lot of time with it. So that's that's the thing in the web world. It actually ends up doesn't matter that much what scripts you include or not include. Yes, it's good habit, and it might be faster for the first time your user visits a website, but that's not going to be a big deal. Thinking about this world in the Android, let's say I declare these dependencies, right? So in my app, I'm saying in my Gradle that I depend on all of these pieces, right? So analytics, right? I'm saying I depend on analytics. Well, how does the user, right? I'm saying I want the analytics, or I'm saying I want Firestore. How does the user end up getting the code for those pieces? Well, what happens is, first of all that code gets, when you tell it to you tell the Gradle to sync, it'll actually download all the code for these dependencies, first of all, onto your computer, right? So all of the code that goes into these things here is now on your computer, and it's actually going to be usually somewhere within your project folder. Okay. That is now bundled. When you go to actually release your app, you're going to build up what we call an APK, application package, which is sort of like a lot like a zip file in a lot of ways in terms of its formatting. But inside of that APK will be all of the code for your dependencies, right? So if I say I'm depending on analytics, Firebase Analytics, all of the code for Firebase Analytics is now shipped with my app. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So every dependency I have here is going to make that APK bigger. Okay, that's the main effect it has, is that everything you depend on here is going to make that APK bigger. And so let's say that does make the APK bigger. What effect is that going to have for your users if the thing they have to download is bigger?
Well, they'll just have to wait, or it'll get a little clunkier, I'd suppose.
Are you talking about like it taking longer to download from the Play Store?
Okay, so that's one of the effects. The more dependencies I have here, it's probably going to take longer to download from this Play Store. Yeah. Anything else?
It'd take up more space on their phone or
Could take up more space
using.
on their phone. Yep, that too. Because the APK ends up having to be stored on the phone. And the third thing is it actually might cost them more to download your app. Because a lot of places, we have largely switched in the US over to we don't charge necessarily per the byte anymore until you go over your data caps, if you have a data cap. But over internationally, a lot of places still, you've got roaming charges and other things like that, where it may still cost them more money. It costs them something to download because it's based on usage. Does that follow? So there's some gotchas there with having a larger download size, having more dependencies, in terms of again potentially making your app bigger. That leads to downloading it from the Play Store is slower. Also worth noting that usually you're going to ship updates through that APK. So next time you ship the version 2 of your app, well, now that second download, depending on how you've done things, that may also be they have to download basically those dependencies again, right? Because you're going from version 1 to version 2 of your dependencies or whatnot. So you have to bundle all those dependencies again. So you're talking about slower, taking a little bit more time to download updates as well as install the initial version. Overall, that's usually not a big deal. Overall, the dependencies most of these dependencies end up being small enough that it actually usually doesn't matter much. It usually doesn't matter too much. It won't slow the app down as it's running. Having all these additional dependencies usually has absolutely zero effect on how the application runs. It just affects how long it takes to download it. So usually I would just take the dependencies that you need or you think you might need and not worry about it too much until you go to put it into your actual user's hands. And at that point, then you pull all the stops to reduce the size of the application as much as you can. That makes sense?
Yeah, Mr. Smith, how big is this APK file? Is there a quick way to know?
That's a good question. That's a good question. It should never be anywhere near a gig. Usually their sizes are measured in megabytes. So let's see if I can find the output here. Open, as I forget where Android Studio puts them.
So games are usually a lot larger than that. Do they include all that data in the APK, or is that like a separate download?
They usually don't. So games typically have some amount of data with them, some amount of the images and video and 3D models and sound and audio. Usually they have some of that in the app. And smaller games will actually have all of that in the app. But for most games, especially if you're dealing with something that's got online functionality, usually what happens is you actually have a very small APK, and then as soon as you download, as soon as you run that game, it will start downloading all the rest. So oftentimes a lot of your assets don't ship with the app itself. Those are usually downloaded later as they're needed when the application runs. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So outside of games, pretty much nobody, I don't really see developers doing that because outside of games, you don't usually have enough data to merit doing that lazy loading or delayed loading processes. Let's see, maybe it's under build outputs, APK, debug. There we go. So this Notepad APK that we built, that we're looking at here, almost 8 megs, still pretty tiny, right? Still pretty tiny. I think when I was doing stuff with Eclipse back several years ago, I think that the app that we were shipping was over 100 megs. Honestly, it might have been smaller, but I think it was over 100 megs. So it was pretty sizable. Part of that is just because Eclipse was not great at optimizing things back in the day. Not as good as things are now, but just a lot of things that we were doing meant to a lot bigger size than today. One of the big things has led actually to a drastic reduction in the APK size is those vector images. You remember how I've kind of shown you anytime we add icons, we've added these as like XML files, right? So this right here, that's the entire image file. See that? So that little text file gives us this, and again, because it's SVG, basically, is vector graphics, it actually scales dynamically to large screen, small screen, so that's actually all I need to bundle. And what we actually used to do is we had to make a PNG for every different screen density that was out there. So that meant that this image, this add icon would have been actually like 5 different PNGs that we'd have to ship in sizes ranging from, say, 16 by 16 to 128 by 128. And everybody had to download all of those images, regardless of what the size of your screen was. So that all those images added up pretty quickly. Cool.
Yes.
Daniel, did you have anything to tack on there? Does that answer?
Yeah, that answers my question.
Yeah. So it's APKs have gotten a lot smaller, primarily with the switch to vector images. That's made a big difference. Another thing to watch, actually one of the most costly things that you can do in terms of your app size today is including fonts. Font files are really big, so that is one of the places where you might consider and make sure you're not including a lot of fonts, or you might load those dynamically. That's, I think, that's the one place where it's like, okay, 1 or 2 font files is enough to really shoot it up, because even just one font file can be 20 megs or more. So those are things you might ship separately, but usually you can bundle everything with your app. Yeah, Yahoo was not on their list. It must have been added sometime this was from 2018, so it must have been added in the past 2 years. I can only assume that there was a demand for it, which is why it got added. And yeah, I know a lot of people, even myself, I used to have a Yahoo email before Gmail came along, and so I still know that there are people that haven't switched, that are still using their Yahoo email. So I can only guess that you're right. It's probably for an older demographic, is why that was added. Yes, they are using lambdas, as you can see here.
I suppose I meant it's not const Google login, but that's neither here nor there, because we're dealing with
Java. I don't. Well, it's const provider.
Oh, but the function, right? Isn't the function?
Oh, the function. Defined? That's fine. Yeah. That's not a big deal. People write their functions. There's really 2 different ways to write your functions, and I honestly haven't seen a definitive, like, this is always the best way. So some people still write their functions like this, function Google login. Some people write it as const Google login equals the lambda thing. I don't know that there's been an agreement yet on which of those two syntaxes are the best.
Oh, okay. I remember you coming down on us like a ton of bricks if we didn't. I don't think I typed the word
The
function.
main reason that I did that is to try to get you in better habits and to use it more.
Yeah, I get
because
it.
I knew that you were familiar with the function syntax from the previous courses, but I wanted to make sure that you got a lot more practice with the lambdas because those are quickly kind of taking over. It is worth noting that I would say that in this case, yes, this is bad because in this case the Google login would become a global variable. It would get attached to window.google login. So yes, yeah, this in this specific case would be a bad thing because it would get added as a global variable. So yes, I would usually write this. I would say writing this as a lambda is better, but there are still different opinions on whether or not you have to do that. Cool.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's things that you'll find mixed code styles. I think that that's the way it's shifting, which is what I've pushed that to make sure that you've got more habit with using const and let and lambdas, but not everybody's agreed on the full conventions yet. Will our pop-up need to be an activity or will redirect from app to website? So in terms of setting up Firebase, it's actually a mix. So when you add these providers, there's first of all, there's two different ways to implement the login. You can either take the UI that they provide off the shelf, which actually comes with pre-built functionality, support logins and creating accounts, as well as even password resets. So if you use the Firebase UI package, you get all that for free, and it's actually really cool and works really well. If you need, for some reason, to build all that UI yourself and need to build it into your app, you can, and you can get into the authentication libraries more deeply, and then you can make the UI look absolutely any way you want. That is doable, but it's really beyond the scope of what we need to do for this semester. So I'm gonna ask that you just use the built Firebase UI tools, so we can spend time on the database rather than spending time on the authentication areas. So with that, what it does, the Firebase UI, the way it operates, that way that package operates, is you basically start an activity, and then from there it takes over, and then eventually it will return a result, because you start it with start activity for result. So then you look at the response when it comes back from that workflow. Does that kind of follow? So effectively, it's going to be an activity that we start. From there, actually, depending on what providers that you have, so the example you're going to see here, I've enabled the email, the Google, and the GitHub providers. Actually, when you click on the sign in with GitHub button, it will actually take you to the browser. You log in there using OAuth because it's using their OAuth process, and will redirect you back to the app when it's done. So with Google, with GitHub, you do actually go to the browser. You do get redirected to the browser for part of that login process. And that is probably going to be the way with some of the other providers. Cool?
Yeah.
So it does depend a little bit on your provider. But the main part that we need to understand is that it's going to come out as an activity that shows up on top. Oh, that's an update. So yeah, there's a question here about the two versions. So there's the real-time database, there's the Cloudflare store. I think this video was filmed shortly after Cloudflare store was released. The next video, which I made optional, which is kind of he redid this for 2020, I think he uses a much stronger term in there, a much stronger language in there to say, yeah, basically we use Firestore for everything. That ends up being the better go-to now. Back in 2018, it was still kind of new and up in the air. So, the real-time database is their original product. Firestore is newer. And I believe that released around 2018 was that when that was put out. But it's really a better model for most things that's there. I wouldn't say, in terms of complexity is really not a good argument for using one or the other. One of the differences, though, is depth. If you have a very deep objects, that is a good time to ask, which makes sense. So part of that is that when you're using the real-time database and I ask for a document, I have to get everything underneath that document. Whereas the way that Firebase is set up, you're just querying and you get one level, you don't automatically get everything underneath there. So that means that you can easily, with the real-time database, you can end up downloading a lot more data than you need accidentally, or be stuck in place where you're downloading a lot of data that you don't need to download. Whereas Firestore, you maybe have to be a little bit more intentional, and it may mean additional trips to the database to get all the data you need, but it ends up usually coming out better. So the problem is the pricing model is kind of weird, because here they're charging you for the storage space and how much you download. So it's basically about how many bytes you're transferring back and forth, and how many bytes you have stored. And you'll notice here it's $5 per gigabyte, so you're getting charged a lot per gigabyte, which means that you really need to keep your database very small using the real-time database. Not a lot of storage space. So this really comes in. The real-time database is good for things that are more in the, I would say today, in the IoT information, Internet of Things is where this is still kind of a little bit useful, depending on your application. There's a lot of IoT applications where this is still, Firestore is still better, is still a better choice. But that can be one of those places where the real-time still exists. Or if you're doing some sort of instant messaging app and you're not concerned about keeping the messages long-term. Does that make sense? Like maybe you have an instant messaging where you're only keeping the last 100 or so messages. Then Firestore could still be a good thing. The real-time database might still be a good thing. But for most of the things we do, if you're really talking about anything that's got CRUD, you're probably going to be better off with the Firestore. Cool.
Mr. Smith, what does WhatsApp use?
What does WhatsApp use? I don't know. I don't know what WhatsApp uses.
Okay. I thought maybe one of these here.
Yeah, I don't know. They might have their own custom rolled solution. They might have Firestore. I don't really know what they're using in the back end. So, yeah, the thing about complexity versus simplicity, that should not be your metric, but to decide the two. The actual nuances is unfortunately a lot more complex than that. And complex data doesn't mean one or the other. Simple data doesn't mean one or the other. It has a lot more to do with your access patterns, and how long is that data sticking around. So like if you have all of your data is temporary, like you don't care about keeping things past, if a month data, if data is a month old and you can throw it away, well then, that's where the real-time database might be an okay fit for you. But if you're not throwing away old data, then it absolutely is Firestore. And most applications are not going to have all their data be temporary. So that's where that kind of fits. Yeah. here they mention, talking about with Firebase, they've got this weird idea in terms of documents that they can either be a random auto-generated ID or they can be one that you specifically chosen. I will say more often than not, it's going to be the latter, where it's a randomly assigned. That's the most common case where you do the same thing as Mongo. But there actually are cases where it makes sense to build out your own IDs. Okay, is everybody tracking with me here? So some of the cases where that might make sense, one of those cases where it might make sense to assign your own IDs is if it is static data, right? So it's static data you are creating in the database and the users aren't going to have CRUD access to in your application. That is one good place. So let's say I have some entries that are, for instance, maybe they are the manufacturers for cars, right? So Mazda and Ford and Toyota. That actually would make sense to give those the ID Mazda, Ford, Toyota, etc. That would actually be perfectly fine because you can define that and you know that they're unique. No big deal there. So they actually become a little bit more efficient than using a document ID. That's okay, right? So if you know the data up ahead of time, then that may be one place that you do that. Or one of the examples that he shows in one of the videos you'll watch is you've kind of got this idea of tags and categories or additional metadata that may go with those things. So there are cases where you may do that. Another case where this arises is if you're doing geolocation type stuff. You might want that document ID to actually be a latitude and longitude. That is the way that some people use it. So you might have in that document ID, it might be 8172, and that's your Latin log. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So things like that, or it might be things that you're doing, like you might have done it as a composite key in the SQL world, where it's joining two things. So like it may be ID underscore ID of thing 2. So it may be both of those two IDs is what you actually put as the quote-unquote document ID. You might do that. That can be sometimes the case. Another one? Oh, another one, and I think this is the one I see the most often, is in theory, most applications, your username is unique, the username that you log in with. So I might log in with PR Smith. A lot of times what people do when they're creating their users collection, when they want to put in profiles, they actually, a lot of times I've seen people use the username as the document ID instead of the user ID as the document ID. And pros and cons to both ways, you can really approach it either way. But some people take that approach, they use the username as the key. Some people take the user ID as the key. Cool. I'd say the user ID is probably the better of those two, but it really depends on what your needs are. But so there's a lot of cases where you may see that be something else other than liquid, where that's exploited. Fully secured apps, yeah. So in terms of if you write your rules this way, allow read and write, you're saying that anybody, at least the way that these rules here are written, you can say anybody can read all of the data in your database and anybody can write all the data in the database, right? That would be a major security problem. Does that make sense? So this is not how you want to write your security rules. You don't want to say everybody can read everything and everybody's allowed to write everything. So when we're talking about, making sure it's fully secured, we're making sure that these security rules should restrict what data you can read as well as what data you can write. So you shouldn't be able to, for instance, edit somebody else's post or somebody else's comment. That's kind of a no-no. You should only be able to manipulate your own data And plus, you may not actually be able to read somebody else's data. If you think about like, hey, maybe I'm building this for a bank. I don't want to let users just read anybody's transaction history. Does that make sense? So when we're talking about fully secured, we're talking about making sure that, yeah, you're authorized to read or write whatever data is there. So those security rules are pretty important. Those are things we need to talk about and walk through. There's one of the videos that I want you to watch today called About Security Rules. That'll give you good fundamentals. I'll show you a little bit of how I've set up my security rules for the Notepad app, so you can see kind of how I've arranged that. I do remember I think I made one mistake in there, so I've got to go. I'll show you how those are set up and what I did. But our index is the same as they were in MongoDB. So good news, almost every database has indexes. Not every database does, not everyone does, but nearly all do. And that exists because without indexes, databases are actually can be very slow. Indexes is the biggest thing in terms of making your data fast to read. Gotcha is with indexes, there's always two downsides to adding indexes. One side of indexes is because they have to be updated every time you write the data. It does make writing the data, whether it's an insert, it's an update, it's a delete, all of those operations will be slower for every index you add. So it does slow down your writes to have indexes. The other thing that it does is indexes do take up space, so they will increase the amount of storage space that your database takes up by having indexes. The storage space is usually completely washed out by the value of having the index in the first place, so storage space is hardly ever a concern for having an index. The only place where you would choose to get rid of an index for storage reasons would be if you maybe only access it, maybe only use that index once a month, and so you maybe don't care about how fast or slow that particular query is. So, there's a trade-off there, but usually the case that people talk about is differences in write versus read performance. As I kind of said last semester, the way that the internet's gone, reads well dominate almost every application. Not every application, but most applications. It's not unusual to see 1,000 reads per write. So you're going to be doing a lot more reads than you do writes, which means that making your writes a little bit slower, usually not noticeable, versus making your reads faster is so much better. So one of the things with most databases, you have to define all of your indexes, and that's done because you want to give the user complete flexibility about what indexes do they have, or what indexes, so you have to create all your indexes that you decide that you want for your whatever applications that you're building. Firebase is a little bit weird in that it automatically indexes everything, sort of. So it indexes every column. So if you have basically 5 properties, 5 columns on your collection, all 5 of those will automatically be indexes, and you actually can't decide not to index those. Is everybody with me there? So the indexes that you have control over and that you can add are what's called a composite index. So a composite index is indexing 2 or more columns together. So a lot of times that happens where you have things like, for instance, in the application that we're going to see, I am getting all the users' notes by user ID, and then I'm sorting them by name. So there's a composite index that includes both their user ID and their name, and that makes it more performant. Okay? So indexes are kind of it's the same idea underneath it in every database, including Firebase, as it was in Mongo. but you actually spend less time creating indexes in Firebase, I would say, than in Mongo, because a lot of those are already automatically added. Cool. But that does mean you have less flexibility in determining how things are indexed in Firebase. Yeah, actually Firebase is the only one that I've seen providing real-time updates out of the box. So, Zach, you'd asked, do other programs, do other databases offer this real-time update on changes? And Firebase is the only one that really does this. That's one of the things that sets Firebase apart. If you change the data in the back end, anything that's listening for data changes, using this very, very simple snapshot mechanism, will get that update. It is possible to write that in, and almost any database can implement that in some way, shape, or form. So, for instance, Mongo does have a way to implement callbacks, where you can say, call this function, let me run some code when there's changes to the database. That is possible, but just because it's there doesn't mean that you can easily automatically get that data back to the client. Because even though that's there down at the lowest level, where you can have your back end can see and do those changes, you have to pipe all those changes up to the front end, which ends up being not usually the easiest thing, and always involves learning a technology called WebSockets. So WebSockets are one way that you can kind of provide real-time updates from your back-end node applications or whatever your back-end's written in to your front-end HTML or Android or iOS, whatever it is. WebSockets are a way to communicate data back and forth there, and so that is what Firebase uses. It's just that they give you that out of the box. They give you that WebSocket connection when other technologies don't give you that for free. Cool?
Yeah.
So that's where that fits in. A lot of database, they're not the only database that can do it, but they're the only one that I've seen that can do it out of the box without you having to write a lot of code. I kind of see. Yeah, I think I answered this already. ID is usually an auto incremented. There's one weird thing here though with how Firebase works. Usually we think of the ID of the thing or the ID of the document. Usually we think of that as a property of the document itself. In terms of Firebase, the document ID is not actually a property of the document. Are you tracking with me here? So like I have these fields, the document ID is not a field. So that means that you have to do something maybe not obvious to get your document ID into, say, your Android app. And I'll show you how to do it. It's actually not that hard, but it's something you have to remember to do because document ID isn't a field. Okay. So you'll see the document ID is this kind of up here, but it's not actually part of the object itself. Yeah. I say that, yeah, like Jonathan said, in terms of talking about queries, I think the queries are similar. The way that you kind of build out your queries in Mongo, or at least basic queries in Mongo versus queries in Firebase, they're actually almost identical in terms of their basic syntax. When it comes to more complicated queries, we kind of touched on it last semester. Mongo has this system now called aggregations, which give you an immense amount of power in terms of running queries and running complex queries. Firebase doesn't have that functionality. So it's actually even little things like doing an or, saying is the price $10 or the price is $20, actually is surprisingly hard in Firebase because their query syntax just isn't as strong. So you can do basic queries there. The more advanced queries are actually a little bit harder to implement, just so you know there. So, and I would say, also even SQL has a better query, a more complete SQL. SQL's got a much more complete query syntax than Firebase does. That's probably one of the biggest downsides, if not the biggest downside to Firebase, is that their querying functionality is really, really limited. You can get a lot of power out of it, and a lot of efficiency out of what's there, especially if you run queries in parallel, because you can run these queries, say run 2 or 3 queries at the same time. So it's not necessary. You can actually oftentimes get around it, from what I understand, in terms of a performance perspective. But it does add some additional code complexity because of things you have to do. Okay, so I would say that at these basic queries, it's pretty intuitive. The more complex queries, even as simple as something like an or, is not as simple, is not as intuitive. Does that help the 3 people here, John and Daniel and Paul?
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah.
Seeing it in practice once we get going, that'll help a lot.
Yeah. I mean, we won't be getting too far. I mean, I think what we will be doing will be pretty simple queries, so you don't have to worry too much about it. But things can get pretty hairy pretty quickly as your queries get more complicated. Honestly, Sheridan, in terms of this test lab thing, I haven't tried it with Android, so I don't know if it works with Android applications. It might or might not. It's either way, it's outside the scope of what we're going to talk about here. So it might work. I don't know if it supports Android apps. I know that it, what he's showing here, he's doing it with a web app, but whether or not it works with mobile, with Android or iOS, I don't know. Okay. Yeah, this is probably a good time to take a break. Let's call it a 15-minute break. Come back at 1:55, and then we'll go through the code example. Okay. All right. So we're gonna walk you through this example application that I shared with you yesterday. And it's basically, as I said, it's similar to what we did with the test, but it's using Firebase. So it's going to we're going to walk through, how do you do account creation, how do you do logins, and how do you have data that your users own, and how do you do, basic CRUD operations with Firebase. So the basic gist of this is every user, you can sign up with an account just using the app, and then log in from there, and you'll have your own little notepad that is private to your user. So all the data that you're seeing is just your user data. Nobody else sees your notes. So let's go ahead and run it, and you can kind of see where this starts. Now, when you start the application, the first thing you'll see, you kind of see it quickly went through a screen that you just saw a login button on there, and it kind of automatically forwarded you to this second screen. Okay, so the second screen is where I can actually log in, and this is one of those things. This is what's the part that's provided by the Firebase UI package. I can sign in with any of the providers that I've hooked up. So for this application, I've hooked up email, Google, and GitHub. So I can sign in with any of those 3 methods. Now, let's say I'm going to go sign in with email. Okay, if I haven't created an account previously, and I think that I haven't created an account on this email, so let me just go through that. So if I haven't created an account before, it's going to say, well, it says I already have one because I forgot I signed up with GitHub before that. So it may redirect you to somewhere else. So there it's redirecting me to Chrome because it wants me to sign in with GitHub. So that would be that. Let me actually go back here and go ahead and use the same one that I have. So this one I've already created an account. So it's going to just take me, once I've typed in the email, it's going to go check that. It's going to determine, have you created an account, have you not? If you've not created an account, it'll ask you to provide a password for that new account. That's built in. And if you've already have an account, it'll go, see that in the database. It says, okay, you already have an account. It will just let me type in the password. Okay, so I can type in the password and hit sign in. Now, if for whatever reason I forget my password, there's actually this trouble signing in link right here. It's actually got password recovery built in. So it'll actually go ahead and send you that email with a temporary link so you can reset your password. So that's even included, which is great. So once I enter the username and password, great. I'm in here. I'm seeing all the notes that I have previously created. So in here right now, I have 5 of my notes. And if you create an account, you can go ahead and try that now. If you create an account, you should get in there and see no notes, right? Because your notes are private to you. Cool.
Yeah.
So things we've got in here, I can click I've got 2 buttons up in the top. I've got a sign out button on the right. I've got a button to add a note there. And I can also go edit any of these notes, or I can go and delete a note if I want to. You'll see I have some confirmation boxes in there. So for instance, delete, there's a confirmation to make sure, are you sure you want to actually delete it? And similarly, if I go to edit, I've got my save and my cancel button. If I hit cancel, it says, are you sure you want to discard your changes? Because both of those cases, whether you're deleting something or you're canceling out of an edit, those are both cases where you're likely to lose data. So anytime the user is likely to lose data, it's usually one of those things. If there's a risk of the user pressing something accidentally, you usually want a confirmation box. Okay, so keep that in mind. Cool. Another thing I will mention in here that I've done, and this is one of those things that a lot of people forget about when they're building apps like this with Firebase or with logins in general. It's very easy to press the back button accidentally. So you do have to think about that, and you do have to think about, what happens if the user presses back accidentally. Where would they go? Well, what was the screen that I was on before this, the screen that has the list of notes?
The login.
The login. So if I hit back, where is it going to take me?
Back to the login screen when you're already logged in.
Which is going to mean, we said with what?
Well, it may show a prompt to log in, or maybe not if you don't have logic to handle it. You might be logged in and it's prompting you to log in.
Depending on how you set it up. It may, sometimes depending on how you set up, yes, you may go there and you'll be quote unquote logged out, or you might go back there and you actually might still be logged in even though you're on the login screen. Or I've even seen this, sometimes you hit back and then depending on how you've written your code, it will redirect you back to the screen because you haven't actually logged out. You haven't done anything with there. So you have to be very careful about handling the back button well, because I think that's one of the biggest pain points that people run into, is they don't really think about that. So what I've done with this example app, actually, if I tap the back button, notice nothing happens. Do you see that? Nothing happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, what were you saying?
I was just wondering where that is in the code, like how you did
I'll show you real quick. It's easy. It's easy to implement that. So because that's a very easy thing to do accidentally, and you think, well, I would, what should happen when I hit back? Well, And you do have to be careful with you want to make sure you're following user expectations. So, it is actually possible to override and change what the back button does. So that's what I've done in this case. I've changed what the back button does, so actually it does nothing. So that means I can't hit back and accidentally log myself out, which I think makes sense for this application. May or may not make sense for the thing you're building, but I would suggest that you at least consider it. It might be a good thing in terms of usability. So the back button does nothing. What I do have, though, is I can click the sign out button here, which is in the top right. Obviously, that's a lot harder to hit accidentally. So I put that there. So we go ahead and hit log out up on the top right, and now we're back here. Okay, so let me show you real quick. You were asking about how you would do that. If I look at the note list activity, which is where we were at when we were logged in, in the note list activity, there is a method called onBackPressed. OnBackPressed is what gets called. It's the handler for when you press the back button. So you can override that to do whatever you want. You can put whatever code into onBackPressed. But because what I've done is I've overridden it and put nothing in there, it's not doing the default implementation. That's as simple as that. I just overrode the base implementation, which takes you back to the previous screen, to do nothing instead. So you could override that to give the user a prompt instead. You could override this onBackPress method to say, well, instead I want to ask them, are you sure you want to log out? You can do that as well. Or you could change, potentially where it takes them. All of those kind of things are possible. So that's how you deal with it. You just override the onBackPress method.
I have a question real fast.
Yep.
Looking at your screen, it doesn't look like you have a main activity.
I don't have a main activity. Yeah, I don't have a main activity.
Did you just change the main activity to the login or something?
Correct. So as I said earlier in this course, and this has been a long time ago, it's normal for you to have a main activity. That's kind of convention. A lot of apps do. But as your application gets more complex, sometimes it may not make sense to have an activity named main activity. So it can make sense to rename it. So the first activity that you see, okay, I'm not calling it main activity, it's the first activity you see, is the login activity. Okay, so what that means is if we look at the manifest, right, you can see it's marked as main and launcher, right? So the thing that makes it the first activity you see, or quote unquote the main activity, is this stuff in the manifest. It's not that it's called main activity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's to say that the main activity isn't necessarily the one where you mainly spend your time. It's just the initial.
Yeah.
Initial activity is probably the better word for main activity.
The what?
The initial activity, like the start.
Yeah. It's like this is the first activity that you see, but yeah, you don't spend most of the time in this app. You'll be spending in the note list activity, and it really doesn't make sense to call that one the main activity either, especially because it would create the misunderstanding to think that the note list activity is the first activity, but it's not. It's where you spend most of your time, but it's not really. It's not really the first. It's not also the first one you see. And so that's why I'm not using the term main activity for any of these, because it would actually just be confusing. Cool?
Yes.
So you can get there just by renaming your activity. So what I did actually is I just renamed main activity to login. Because I felt that was less confusing. Similar, I also renamed my layout from activity main to activity login. So that's how I got there. Okay, so let's talk about the authentication process. What's happening in this login activity? Now, before I get into there, I do want to mention briefly the application code I have. So if we look at the Notepad app class, you'll see I have a few fields. I have some constants. So I've got a reference to this shared preferences object, which for I think the last lab, I asked you to kind of look into it and read up on it. for one of the things there with the shopping cart. And so the shared preferences, you may remember, is just a way to save data to a file. So there's a very tiny amount of information that I may have reason to save. So I'm getting a reference to shared preferences, and I've also got a variable here to store the current user ID. This is not strictly required here, but it does make a lot of things easier, at least easier to get to, because you've got a lot of different places in the code where you'll end up needing to get to the user ID. So making that something that's part of the application does overall, I think, make the application easier to work with. So that's why I'm putting it here, because I need to access this user ID in a few different places. So in terms of what I'm doing in the onCreate, you'll see I'm opening up the file. So I'm saying get shared preferences. Get shared preferences takes 2 arguments. The first one is the name of the file, and that is mode private. So let's open up the shared preferences file, and I'm going to call that file preferences. Okay. From there, I want to say, well, let me get the preferences, the user ID out of that file. So we're going to say get string, the name of that, the key of that is user ID, and the default value is null. So I'll try to read that from the file when the application starts. And that way I have, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to track in this variable whatever the user's user ID is. And I'm treating this as a string, so it could be anywhere. This works for Firebase, but it could easily work if you're using some other database scheme as well. So I've got 2 accessors in here. I've got a getter, so I can say get user ID. Pretty simple, just returns the user ID. I also have a setter. Setter's got a little bit more to it, so it's going to save that to this field, but it's also then going to save it to the shared preferences file. And so the way that we write to shared preferences is this little series of things here: shared pref, edit, put string, preference, user ID, the user ID, and apply. And so the only reason I'm really writing that to the file is because I want that to be persisted and not go away if the user stops the application or the device is shut down or things like that. I want to remember what user ID they're logged in as. So that helps me track their session. Okay? Is everybody tracking with me on that and kind of understand the reason for doing that?
Where is it set in the code? To me, I missed that. It's got to be in the login activity.
Yeah, it's in the login activity. We'll get to it. So the set gets called from the login activity. That's the only place. Actually, the login activity, and it also gets set when we log out. When we log out, we'll also be setting the user ID to null. So it's both in the login process and the logout process. The get then gets used in a variety of places. Actually, gets used on all of the screens. So this doesn't actually get used on every screen, but the setter only gets used on 2. So let's talk about the login activity. So the login activity, the layout for it is really simple, at least the way I've set it up. You can absolutely add more to it. The only reason that I did it the way it was is just to try and keep the example simple. So on the screen, all I've got is a login button. That's it. You could put anything else on here that you want to put on here, but for all intents and purposes, the user is not going to see this most of the time. So I probably would put my logo on there if I was going to flesh this out. I might actually make this like a loading screen. Oftentimes is what I would put here instead, where I might say, hey, we're loading the application. If it doesn't load, then hit login, kind of thing. Because again, this is more of a sort of holding screen than anything else. All right, so looking at the code for the login activity. In terms of onCreate, I'm grabbing the login button. I'm getting the application just as we've seen before. And the next thing I'm doing, and this is not a, this is something that may or may not work for you. This is something that is the way I have set the application up, but isn't a strictly mandatory thing. What I'm saying here at the end of onCreate is I'm saying login button.perform click. So what that does is it initiates as if the user had clicked on the login button. So I'm automatically clicking on it for them. And that means when the application starts, it immediately launches the login process. If I took this one line of code out, if I took out that line that says login button.perform click, when the application runs, they would always see this screen first, whether they've been logged in or not. Okay. So by doing that, I'm able to kind of shortcut past this screen most of the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see.
And one of the reasons that I want to do this is login button.perform click rather than calling on login directly. If I call on login here directly, then it will still be in the process of the application being created. And that can be a problem in terms of your transitions sometimes. If I say login button.perform click, it actually won't perform that method immediately. It will actually wait until to perform the click until the screen actually the activity is actually started. So that's the reason that's the real reason that I'm doing it that way, is so that it gets delayed until the proper time. So that's one of those tricks you want to keep up your sleeve. Sometimes you need something to actually perform as it's clicked, not as a method call. So that's what I'm doing there, and that's what kicks it off when you start the application, where it either takes you over to this screen or it takes you over to the note list screen. Okay, so when you actually click on the button, what I call is on login. So this is what I've called that handler, right? And so if you were to look, for instance, at the activity login, look at the code over there, you would see I've just said on click is on login. So again, when you click on that, that's what's going to happen. So I'm doing a quick log to say the sign-in process is starting. That's very helpful from a debugging perspective to kind of see what's going on, to see some of those major events. So that helps. The next thing I'm doing is I want to go ahead and take the user past this login if they're already logged in. And so that's where this block of code comes in. So first thing I do is I say Firebase auth.get instance. That will get me an instance of the Firebase auth object. And then I can say get current user. So that together will give me the user, the current user that is either logged in, or if they're not logged in, that'll come back as null. So I can just look at that and I can know, are they logged in or are they not logged in? So if they are logged in, this will come back as non-null. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to say the application which we just saw, I'm going to say let's save the user ID so I have it for later, and go ahead and send them to the note list.
Hey,
Yep.
I don't know if you'll cover this. I don't think I've seen this before. In line 60, it's just return. Why not return user?
What's the return type of this function?
Well, it's void. I mean, why would you have to do anything?
It's void. So I can't return anything, right? Because the thing when you return what the return type of that function is, right? So this function would have to return a Firebase user for me to say that. But if I change this to Firebase user, then my onClick would stop working because the signature of your onClicks has to return void. Tracking with me there?
Signature of your onClick has to return void.
Yeah.
Why do we have to return anything?
This has to be void. This has to be void because onClick needs to be void. Any onClick or listener that you write, that's part of your interface that you're implementing.
Okay, 100% of the time onClick returns void.
Has to be void. It has to take a view as the single argument, and it has to return void. It has to have that signature. Otherwise, if I change that to anything else, when I click on the button, nothing will happen.
All right, so the return on line 60, that's just it's because we're returning something and...
No. So again, so what I talked about first there is the first question of why am I not returning the user? The answer is I can't, and I really shouldn't. So the next question is, what is it doing? Well, remember, return has an additional thing that it does. Return says, I'm done with the function. Don't run any more of this method.
Okay, so on login is done. All this stuff on line 66 and 71.
Yeah. All this stuff doesn't happen if the user is logged in.
So if you will, it's kind of like break in a switch.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, that helps.
It's very similar. And so another way I could have written this, if I wanted to get rid of the return, is that, right? I could have just taken this and put it in the else. Either coding style is fine, right? So this here, if I take everything and put it in the else and don't have the return, is the same as what I just had. That's a coding style thing, right? So I tend to use returns more often in my code because oftentimes I feel like that's more readable than the other way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I get it now.
But that's a subjective thing. Not everybody feels the same way about returns. But I often return early in my functions. So I say, hey, there's a case here. I don't need to do anything else, right? So that's the reason I'm doing is I don't want the rest of this code to run, and I don't want to have to increase the nesting of all that code down there. So then in the case where you aren't logged in, I'm going to make sure that the user ID gets set to null, just to make sure that those things are in sync. This generally will not do anything because most of the time it should already be null if we get here. But if for some reason maybe they're session timed out, then this would actually be resetting it to null. Okay, so if they're not logged in, we'll set their user ID to the saved user ID as null. Save that to the preferences file, and then this is where we actually spawn the login. That's this sign out process. This code here, this is basically taken verbatim from the documentation. I personally don't know a lot of what's going into this code. I pulled it from the documentation, and to some extent, I kind of don't need to know how it works because it just kind of does, and it's meant for that case where you really don't need to understand it. So I do want to walk through it a little bit and show you how you can finagle it to fit your scenario. The first thing we're doing though, and this is again, this stuff's pulled from the code example. The first thing you have to do is build out the list of providers that you need. So here I'm saying, let's create a email provider, a Google provider, and a GitHub provider. So that's those three providers is what's giving me those three buttons. Does that make sense? So for instance, if I wanted Facebook in there instead of GitHub, then I would create a Facebook builder instead of a GitHub builder. Okay, so whatever providers you put in here, those are the things that are going to show up. Or if I want to say, well, let's not let people log in through GitHub anymore, all I really have to do is remove the GitHub provider from there, and you'll see it drop off. And so now there's just sign in with email and sign in with Google. Does that make sense? So whatever 2 or 3 providers that you're choosing, that's where you'll put them. That's where you'll configure this to be your list of providers. Okay? Pretty simple.
Yeah, so far.
Mr. Smith?
Yep.
Do you actually have the sign in with Google and sign in with GitHub fully implemented in this app?
I do. The Google will probably not work for you if you try it. And
is it because we're going to need an API key, or?
So let me show you. I'm going to log in with my account, and you can kind of see just to see what it does when it does work. So here I'm going to go in as KC. And I'm going to type in my password off screen. Nope, I don't want to set up sync. And I'm getting some additional screens in here because this device has never had, it's basically a clean device. I haven't signed in with Google from there. If you've already signed with Google, you're going to get a little bit of a different UI than what you're seeing here. And so once I go in, here's my login. Okay. You will probably be getting an error. I think that's what you're getting at, right? If you
I get an error for Google and GitHub.
Okay, so you remember the thing that we did yesterday with the SHA-1, the command line that we had to run?
Yeah.
So that SHA-1, I took from my computer and I put it into the Firebase configuration. Well, your SHA-1 is different than my SHA-1 because it's based on that SHA-1 comes from your debug key store is what they call it, the Android debug key store. That Android debug key store is randomly generated when you install Android Studio. So everybody here has a different number in their key store. Has a different hash for that key store. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that means that when you build the application, it's going to fail to let you log in because your SHA-1 doesn't match what I've set up in Firebase. So in order for it to work for you, you would need the same key store that I have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I guess for like a production app, the security would work a little differently then.
Yeah, it would have to work a little. It still uses a SHA-1. The catch is that you have to make a key store that you use, and then you use that every time you build a new version. So whoever does that build has to have that same key. Does that make sense? That same signing key.
Yeah.
So it's a way to prevent, part of it exists there as sort of a way to prevent other developers from kind of stealing your database and being able to provide their own login mechanism. Another way I could have done that, another way to work around that, if you have multiple developers, remember when we added that as an Android app underneath the project. So if I had, say, 3 people that are developing on my team, I could add three different Android apps, quote unquote. And so like I'd have an Android app for Paul, I'd have an Android app for Corey, I'd have an Android app for Daniel. And so we'd put we'd put the SHA-1 for each of those different developers into there. Does that make sense? But so you can work around it with that way. That does mean that you have a different google.json file for everybody, which also means you can't upload that to Git because everybody needs a different version of that file. So you can manage that way, or you can manage it with everybody using the same debug key store, which actually is usually what we end up doing. We usually end up having it's like, we'll generate the key, what first person installs Android Studio, we'll save that debug key store it somewhere, and then every new developer that comes on the team will give them that same debug key store when they join the team. Does that make sense? So that's how we solved it. Is we had a key store that just everybody used the same key store file.
So if you had sent this to us with an APK, you built that and, I don't know, email it or however, and then we installed it, then it would work.
Yeah, if I'd given it to you as an APK, then yes, you could have used it because that APK that I generated would have been signed with my key store, right? So if I gave you an APK, that APK would work for you and you'd be able to log in as Google. But that's things to keep in mind because obviously when I go test your application, am I going to have the same SHA-1 as you? Probably not, right? So that means, I may have to do some finagling in order to test Google login or things like that with your system. So one of the reasons, that's one of the reasons I said I need everybody to do an email login, because the email login doesn't require that SHA-1 to match. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand now. Yeah. I got the 10 error, which I guess that means the SHA-1 is not matching.
I would have to look at it. There should be more there than just an error code.
Oh, okay. That's what popped up. I think it was a toast or something. I had to try it again. Whatever. I get it. I understand why it doesn't work now.
Yeah. So if that SHA-1 matched yours, it would have worked. Or if I gave you an APK, it would work. But it should still work if you do sign in with email. It just won't work for the other mechanisms, sign with Google or sign with GitHub, because the SHA-1 needs a match. Okay. So these basically, it's really just these two lines of code that launches all this logic. So the first line of code, you just say, here is the providers that I'm going to use. And the second one is, you see your start activity for result. Okay, so we know that. We've done that before. We say, okay, well, start activity for result takes an intent plus the request code. So you can see that the first argument is a little bit long. We'll come back to that. Second argument is request auth, which I've defined up here as 1, right? So we're sending it with a request code of 1. That's because when this finishes, whether it succeeds at logging in or not, it's going to end up coming back down here to on activity result with that request code, where we'll do the next part. So here we're saying auth UI, get instance, create intent builder, yada, yada, yada. This is basically, again, this is just pulled almost verbatim from the documentation. If you look at the documentation of how to use this, it'll basically give you this line. So that's the build. You use this builder, you build it up. I've added, and you provide the providers here. Right, so the providers we declared go in on line 75. Two things I've added. They're further down on the same documentation page, but you usually want, if I don't set either of these two things, then this login functionality doesn't look great. I'll show you what it looks like without those two things. So you notice I kind of have this black and white theme, and if I don't set those, you see how it goes, and it's this blue theme, right? So if you don't set the theme, this Firebase UI has its own theme that it will default to. So by setting a theme to r.style theme.firebase notepad, what I'm saying is use my application theme that I'm using for my app. And the way you're going to find out what this is not going to be the same name for you. So here it's theme_Firebase notepad for me. But it's actually going to be different when you do that. So if I look under themes, well, my theme here is called theme Firebase notepad. If you say maybe my app is named menu builder, well, this would be theme.menu builder. So the name of the application is actually going to be here, which means that this theme name is going to be different. Is everybody tracking with me?
Yeah, I see why you're doing it.
So that's why I'm doing that, so to get it so the login doesn't have a completely different theme than the rest of my application. So that's a really important thing to do. It doesn't show it in the base example if you're looking at the code online, but please make sure that you do that. Another thing you'll want to do, there's an option here as well to set the logo. If you don't set a logo, you're going to have a big white area up here with nothing. And if you do set the logo, then you can put whatever image you want. Whatever image you supply as the logo is going to appear up here. So I'm giving it my application logo as well as my application theme. So that's important. Any questions on that first part?
So is this not, I mean, besides the theme and the logo, is not much changes with ours?
Nope. The only thing,
basic functionality.
yeah, yours is going to look identical. The only thing you'll need to change out is whichever providers you're using. Cool. So now let's look at what happens when you get the result back. And again, actually, a lot of this is taken from the documentation, so you can find it there too. So when we get on activity result, it'll come back here, and we want to check that the request code is what we used up here. So we use 1 up here. I'm also going to use 1 down here. I want to have that as a constant, which is what I've done. So request auth, the request code is 1, and then I can go get the response, which is you find out, was it successful? Did it fail? Yada, yada, and get more details on it. So I'm getting this IDP response object. If it's okay, so if its result's okay, that means the user has successfully signed in. Okay, so they've gone through all the process, whichever provider they use. They might have used email, they might have used Google, they might have used GitHub, but if it was successful, it will get into here as result okay. So there I can say, well, give me the user object that they logged in, Firebase auth, get instance current user. And then I'm going to show toast. So I'm going to say here, let's show a toast. And this is just for debugging purposes. I'm showing the user ID, the email, and the display name, so I can see that it's working and see what that information is. So that's just quick for debugging, showing a toast. Next up, I want to save that user ID to shared preferences, because remember, I wanted that to be available and up to date for my other screens. So when that succeeds, this is where I save the user ID. Does that answer your previous question, Paul, about how set user ID gets called?
Yeah, clearly it does. I'm just terrible with the intents of these requests, auth codes, and all that.
Yeah.
Where is that set originally? Like, where does that come from? The request auth, because I see it set as a static variable up at the top.
It's line 29.
Okay, so when that's called, that's just done by the virtue of clicking the button, right? I mean, that's just generated with the code.
No, this I defined. I defined that line of code, right?
Yeah, I see that. But when we get down to okay.
So remember, I say start activity result. I provide the request code, and then it comes back to me in on activity result. So you set it. You basically send it in start activity for result, and you receive it in on activity result. Those two methods are paired together. So if I send 1 here, then I need to listen for 1. If I send 2 here, I need to listen for 2. So I want to make sure that the number here is exactly the number I have here.
Yeah, it's either going to be 1 or null, right? I mean, it's pretty much what it's going to be.
It could be other things, because the system has other things where it may be using the start activity for result. I wouldn't rely on it being 1, or it can be any number realistically. I wouldn't rely on it strictly being that, which is why we always check the number. So for instance, if you're doing like camera stuff, you may have other cases and different things that are sending requests. So if it's successful, then we're going to grab that, save the user ID, and finally call my go to note list method, which is down here. So in the case that you're already logged in, or in this case where you've finished and successfully logged in, both of those cases take you down here. And so go to note list just says, let's make an intent, go for the note list activity and start activity. And you'll notice I'm not adding any extras. I don't need to pass any data when I go over to the note list activity. Why is that? Why do I not need to send any extras to that activity?
Because we're getting everything, right?
Nope. So the next screen, right? What does the next screen do? It shows me my list of notes, right? So you might think, well, maybe I need to send the user ID with that request, with that intent. And you could do that, but I don't need to. So the reason I'm not sending the user ID here with that intent is because I've stored it in the application. So all of my screens can get the user ID from the application. Does that make sense? And that is the up-to-date version. The problem with sending it as part of the intent is, well, if it changes, the intent doesn't change, right? The intent's fixed as soon as I start the activity. So that can actually get you into some issues if you're kind of end up in this weird state where you're logged in, where you think you're logged in, but you're not logged in. So that's, I would not recommend sending the user ID along. You could, but I would not recommend doing it. In terms of that, that's what happens there. If there's a failure, so for instance, if I go back, what happened there? I think I clicked it twice. If something goes on and I click back or I cancel out of it, etc., you should see it come here back as an error, which would trigger this case. Although it seems to be, I'm not entirely sure what's happening there because it seems to be crashing when I leave. Investigate that. But so that's the idea. If it's successful, then do this. If you sign in didn't go through, if something went wrong, then we can inspect and look at the error and show that to the user in a toast. Okay. So that's really all there is to the login screen. Any questions on that login screen? So obviously the way I've structured this, this is the first screen that you see. You go through the login screen as the first screen you see when you start the application. That makes sense for for a lot of applications. I think that's what a lot of apps end up doing is you put the login screen first before you do anything else. There's definitely value to that. Not all apps do that though. Some apps will actually let you start using the app without creating an account. And so that's one of the things to think about and consider as you're building your application. Maybe the login screen, maybe it's the first thing you see, maybe it's not. One of the downsides of putting the login screen first is that, well, the user can't use the application now until they've created an account. And that can be enough of a wall that sometimes you can lose users right there because they decide, well, I don't want to actually create an account. Or they have trouble signing in. Everybody tracking with me there?
Yes, of course, that makes sense.
So that's a thing to think about. That you might wait to put that login screen until something happens that the user needs to be logged in for, right? So, but for this application, well, I can't do anything. I can't have a notepad unless I have an account, right? There's actually no functionality for me to use in this case if I didn't have a login. And that's where a lot of apps actually end up landing, is there may actually be no functionality that the user could use without having a login first. And so then, putting the login screen first is perfectly acceptable. The other thing that honestly putting a login screen first does is it can make your app simpler, because if you can say, well, we can only get to screens X, Y, and Z if we're logged in, well, then that's a whole lot of screens you don't have to check that the user's logged in, or you don't have to figure out how to pop up the login screen. So that, this does make it a lot simpler if you can move the login screen to the first screen. Cool. So things to consider. You potentially might be losing users if it's the first screen, but it does keep the application simpler. And that's that. Okay, so let's talk about reading the data. So this obviously I've got in a recycler view. And let's look at the note list activity. So in terms of the note list activity, if we look at, I've got two methods. I've got onCreate and I've got onStart. OnCreate is actually where, remember, usually we put all of our stuff that happens when the application starts. In this case, it actually, there's a reason I'll get into here. There's a reason I want to actually split these things apart. So I've got some code in onCreate, which is doing some initial setup that I only want to do once. And then I've got some additional code in onStart, which actually I do want to run multiple times. Is everybody tracking with me? So remember, onStart doesn't just get called once. It does get called the first time you go to the screen, but it also will get called every time I come back to it. Okay, it's called every time I come back to it. So if I stop the screen, if the application gets stopped because I go to another screen or another app or anything like that, we'll get stopped, and then this will get called again, and we'll call onStart. So in terms of what I'm doing here, my goal is to get all of the notes from the database. So first thing I'm going to do is I need to, get access to the database. That's pretty simple. Firestore, Firebase Firestore.get instance. That gives me my database instance. And then from there, remember, we kind of follow the same logic as Mongo, where a database is composed of collections. So I need to say, which collection do I want? So I want my notes collection. That's where I'm going to store all my notes, is in the notes collection. And then I'm going to say where, I have a where clause, where equal to. I'm going to say where the owner ID property is equal to the user ID of that you're logged in as. So I'm only getting the notes that belong to you. Is everybody tracking with me? Any questions on that? So I want to say, let's get the notes, so you can add where clauses effectively there. If I didn't have this where, then I would say, give me all of the notes in the database. And as it turns out, if I do that, if I remove this one line of code, we'll actually see that an error occurs here. It says permission denied, missing or insufficient permission. So if I don't have that clause in there, it's going to say you can't do this because I've got a security rule in the database that says, I only want to allow you to see, only want you allowed to read and write records that belong to you, right? So without that, I will get a security denied permit thing. It's worth noting it doesn't just give me the ones that belong to me. It just says, hey, you can't get any if you don't have that in there. Okay, so I'm going to say, okay, I need to only get my own, and then I'm also going to order them by title. So it's going to order them by title ascending. Okay.
If you leave that out, then it'll sort them by the document ID or object ID.
I think so. Which sorting by the document ID might as well be random for all intents and purposes, right? Yeah. So if it's sorted, if I don't specify an order by, then it's like note 4, note long, note 3, note 2, note 1, and note 2. It's worth noting that's not even the order that I created them in, right? I didn't actually create note 4 first, and I didn't create it last either. So it doesn't out of the box sort it in the order that you created or manipulate the things in. So you always actually end up wanting to put in an order by. Cool? Because otherwise it's just going to be random. Now it's worth noting, because I'm doing a where over the owner UID and the title fields, I'm doing order by over those two fields. I've actually created a composite key, and we'll look at that on the back end, that covers those two things. That's one of those things that you do to make it more efficient. So I've got a composite key for those two things. finally here I have my snapshot listener. So my snapshot listener, this is where it becomes really cool, and this is where Firebase does the real-time stuff that nobody does out of the box. So I say add snapshot listener. I provide it a link to the activity, explain why I'm doing that. That's actually really, really important that you pass the activity here. The next thing I then provide is my callback. So this is the function that's going to get called when I receive data. Now, one of the things I've mentioned, and one of the things, again, you'll see in the videos, is that Firebase provides some offline caching support out of the box. So actually, this callback is going to, as it turns out, get called twice. The first time this callback gets called, it actually pulls from the local cache copy of the database. The second time it will be from the network, which actually means in most cases that the user will see the data lightning fast. They'll see the data very quickly because it will more likely just be cached on their device. Okay. Also, what happens here, because I've registered the snapshot listener, anytime the data changes, so if I were to go to the back end here, let me go into the project, make sure I'm in the Notepad project. Because I've got that snapshot listener, if I go to Firestore, let's see, this is, let me see if I can find note 1.
Your stream ended.
Oh, well, that's weird. I don't know what's killing it every once in a while. So I'm looking at Firestore, right? So here's my note 1. If I just go change the title on the back end, notice how quickly that updated. Do you see that? So like one user, maybe somebody else is updating it, or I'm updating on another device, and immediately update it here. That's really cool. That's really, really cool. So, and that's amazing, especially when you're dealing with like social apps, or you can just say, hey, you know what, you're chatting with somebody, automatically, hey, those changes are across, and I really didn't have to do very much. Because really all I'm saying is, if there's not an error, if there is an error, then we're going to show it. And if there's not an error, well, then let's say, give me the items that come back from that query and put them in the adapter. So I'm going to say adapter set items. Great. Everything's up to date. And so, that's really, really, really simple. Now, I do want to talk about this line real quick. So items, which is a list of notes. Here I'm saying value. So value is the response, the snapshot that you get. And then I'm calling two objects. So value two objects actually takes this response that we got back, and I'm actually telling it to read it as a list of notes. So each of the objects that we come back, I'm going to read them as note objects. Okay, so define that class. Let's look at the model class real quick. Model class is actually really simple. Similar to how we've done stuff. So it's got an ID, it's got a title, it's got a body, owner ID, created it at, and updated at. It's worth noting that all of these names here, these properties, need to match exactly what you have in the database. So if I were to look at what's in my database right now, you would actually see those exact same names here, right? So we've got, ignoring the ID for a minute, because you'll notice there's no ID field. There's the title, the body, the owner ID, owner UID, created at, and updated at. So they're the exact same names here as they are there. Is everybody following on the model side?
Yeah. How would that look if there was another object within there, or an array, or?
Yeah, just like we've done previously. Same way you would model things with Volley and Retrofit.
Okay.
So if you had if I had here an array of, if I had like a map, I can say map, and so this is like tags, and I could say cool boolean true, And maybe let me add another tag here.
Yeah, and to review, the map is like an array. That's the square brackets.
No, a map. Yeah, a map is like an object.
Okay.
Map is like an object, or you can model it as a hash map, or you can model it as another object. So this tags, can I add another one here? Cool, awesome. There we go. So I could model this as a tags object with the properties awesome and cool, which would both be Booleans, or I could model as a hash map. Either of those would work.
So a map goes with Booleans and a hash
No, a map can be anything.
Okay, but it's an object, right?
It's like an object. Think of it like an object. Because one of these could be, for instance, that could be, I could have one of these in here that's a string. I could have another that's a Boolean.
If we're going to... okay, yeah, I get it. It can be different types. So if this is going to be built out over there in an Android Studio, I'm just kind of going from memory or what I think would be right. It would be... Would anything need to be in the note class, or will we just have to do a separate tags class?
So this would be, you'd have both, right? So we have, this is the properties that are directly on the note, and then the tags would be like, I'd have note tags class as well.
All right, so in there, would be like the new line 13, would it be public tag, and then you build out another file?
Well, I wouldn't call it tags. I would call it note tags, because more than likely I will have like product tags or something else. So I would call it like note tags, and this would be tags.
Okay.
Because the name of the property here is tags.
Wow. Yeah, if you got something like 4 or 5 levels deep, that'd be tough to follow. But yeah, I got it. So it'd be note. Yeah, you just do another one and you put in your Boolean and your looks like a string you got there.
It could get pretty deep. Typically, though, this is one of the things where Mongo and Firebase are a little bit different. Mongo, you can kind of just go as deep as you need to, and that's usually not a big deal. For Firebase, you actually want to keep things shallow. So typically, it's not a. You can go further down in there and have a bunch of nesting. I would usually recommend, I would say avoid, though you probably don't want to have an object inside of here. I probably don't want to have another key in here that is obj. Let's see if I can get object in there. I don't think I can. I don't know if I actually can. Reference. Yeah. As far as I know, you can't. Oh, there. No, map. I can put another object in there. So A, B, C, D. So I could nest another object in here, and yes, sometimes you do need to do that. That's usually something you want to avoid.
Yeah, in that case, you would just have another class that, or you would put in note tags, public, obj.
If I could, I would flatten this. Sometimes you can't flatten the structure. Sometimes you do need this nesting. But if you can flatten it, then it can be worth doing so. So type-wise, you'll notice I have strings for those. That's pretty obvious. Title, body, owner ID, owner UID. No big deal there. You'll notice I have a created at and a updated at timestamp. And you'll notice that these are the type timestamp. Timestamp is actually a Firebase class. That's what that's happening. So if you do need to put timestamps into your database, that's the type you want to use. Cool.
Yeah. I'm tracking now.
So, and one thing on the document ID, there's a special annotation here, document ID. You do need to add that if you want to get the document ID. If I don't have the annotation here, then it will be looking for a field named ID rather than mapping that up to the document ID.
All right, so line 7, it's always going to look the same if we need the document ID. It's not going to be called underscore ID or anything like that.
It can be called anything. Actually, the name of this doesn't matter. What matters is the annotation.
Really? It'll find it if you change that instead of string ID, it'd be zebra, it'll still work the same.
Yeah, that'll work. It doesn't matter. It doesn't. The name of the variable really doesn't matter in Firebase's mind. All that matters is it's annotated with document ID, and so as long as it's annotated with document ID, it will pull the document ID.
Okay, but the rest are sensitive to that. You have to.
The rest are sensitive.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, the document ID, you can call that wherever variable you want. I would just stick with ID. But the other ones, yes, you do need to name them exactly how the field is, including the casing. So like if this is created at, if I were to change this to a lowercase a, then I would be getting back nulls because there's no created at with a lowercase a.
Okay, your stream ended again.
Okay. So it is case sensitive, but that's kind of how you do the modeling. And we can talk more about that if you have questions tomorrow or Monday, because I think that the videos will help illuminate some of the modeling kind of things to think about. But in this case, I've just got a simple flat object. Okay, so the toObjects method is how you take that. So that basically will take, okay, here's a list of things. I want to treat them as this class. And so that's what gets us from the snapshot to being a list of notes. So that's that. And again, it's worth remembering, this snapshot callback is going to get called every time there's new data. So it gets called the initial time to go get your data, but it's also going to get called as there's potential data changes on other clients or on the server itself. Also worth noting, I mentioned that this word this here, passing the activity, is super, super critical. If you don't do that, okay, if you don't pass the activity here, it will continue listening for changes. Your listener, your snapshot listener won't get unhooked. So it'll be constantly listening for data, even if this activity is destroyed or goes away. That can cause a lot of problems, right? So if I don't pass that, then I have to write in code to remove that listener. Does that make sense?
I'm not getting it. You have to write in code to remove that listener?
To remove the snapshot listener. Otherwise, it won't get unbound. So adding in the word this, passing the activity, what that does is it will, this Firebase will now watch the activity and see if the activity is stopped or destroyed or whatever. So as soon as the activity is stopped, it goes off screen, this callback will stop listening. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
callback will automatically. Huh?
Does it create a memory leak if you leave it like that?
If you leave it without this,
yeah,
you have you have a memory leak. You're also going to get charged for all the data that your database is sending to your app, even though it's not being used. So actually, you'll get charged a bunch of extra because you're doing reads, because that will trigger database reads, even though there's nobody listening for those reads.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So.
But you delete it and it would still work, though.
It would still work.
Okay.
Until somebody does something on another app. Like let's say I take this out. Let's say I take this out. Then this callback listener could be called when I'm no longer on the screen. That actually could cause my app to crash. So there's for a whole host of reasons there, making sure your application doesn't crash because you're doing things like when the activity is destroyed and you're not getting extra charges, and yeah, make sure you do that. I really wish that they didn't provide two overloads here, like one that doesn't take an activity, one that does. I kind of understand why that's there, because there are cases, especially if you're doing listening in a worker, or you worker or service, then you don't have an activity. So I understand why that's there. But that's there. And so that's the other reason that this is on start. If I had done this in on create, it would have started listening initially, and it would have stopped listening as soon as I left the screen, and they would never pick it back up. So because this causes the listener to be unhooked, to be deregistered, when I stop the activity, I need to start it again in on start. So by doing this as on start, that's what allows it to be up to date if I say go and add an activity and come back, or add a note and come back. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Because this will be called again. I can show this. I can actually show this. Let me just move this code up to on create, and you'll see what happens. So if I made the mistake of putting this in on create instead of on stop or on start, then let's say I go edit note 2, and let's make it note 22. I'm going to hit save. Notice how it still says note 2. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Because when I left the screen, my callback listener got stopped, and on create didn't get called again. So I need to make sure that, if you're listening and setting up snapshot listeners, you want to make sure that first of all you give it an activity, and then you want to make sure you're doing it in on start. So those are important things to pay attention to there. As far as other details, looking at the menu, I've got a menu, so I've got an add button, I've got a sign out button. Those are being hooked up here, so I've got on create options menu, on options item selected. You've got the on back pressed, so that'll say if you were to go to home. You'll notice I've removed the home button though, for the same reason that I want the users to be explicit about signing out. So but if you did have a home back button, I'm saying make that pay the same as the back. They can click the log out button, which takes them to on log out. They can click the add button, which takes them to on add. So in terms of logging the user out, this again is something that you can find most of the code in the documentation. So you say auth UI.getInstance, and we say, hey, I want to do a sign out, and provided the context. So this will kick off the sign out, get them logged out. I'm adding a success listener as well as a failure listener. So if everything goes good and they get successfully signed out, we're going to set the user ID to null and finish and close this activity, go back to the login screen. If things go wrong, they don't get logged out, then we're just going to show an error. Does that make sense? Questions on logging out there? So you'll see this in a few other places where when I'm adding things to what we call, you can kind of see this as a task. Oftentimes you'll see you'll need to add a success listener as well as a failure listener to say, here's what you want to do successfully, and here's what you want to do failure. If you click on the add button, we're just sending an intent to send you to the note edit activity. Now, one of the things you may have already noticed, but is worth seeing here, notice that I don't have an add activity. Does everybody see that? So there's a note edit activity, but there is no add activity. The reason I do that is just actually to save on code, because the note and the add and the edit are almost identical. So oftentimes you can get away with sharing code. And the only difference between add and edit is when I start the activity. If I start the activity as an edit, I'm going to send the note ID. If I'm starting it with an add, then I don't send the note ID. Do you see that? So I'm not providing a node ID to edit, so it's going to add a node. Vice versa, if I were to go to look at the adapter, for instance, I've got my edit button. That one ends up putting this extra node ID into that intent, but it sends it, sorry, down here, sends it to that same node edit activity. If you want to dig through, the delete button, you can kind of see what that does with the adapter. So you can see there's a, hey, here's, on delete. First thing I got to do is spawn the dialog, and then we need to perform the delete. So in terms of performing deletes on Firebase, here, maybe this is a little bit out of order, but deletes, get the database, grab the collection, similar to what we've seen before. Then you can say grab a specific document. So the notes collection, the document with this ID, whatever item you clicked on, and then we're going to say delete it, and then we can say the on success and on failure, kind of like we saw a second ago with login, log out. So if it's successful, then we're going to remove it from the list, and that, yeah, I think that. Where is that? How does it already update the database? I knew that was working. Let me see. So if I delete this, yes, yeah, gone. Okay, so I removed it from the list. We're all good. Yeah. So that's kind of the logic behind that.
A couple questions is I noticed there's no message sent to the user like item deleted or there was a problem.
Well, if there was a problem, it would go here.
Okay.
I think it is. You're right. It is missing a task. It is missing a snack bar.
So it's just an oversight.
That's just an oversight. I think. Yeah, that's just an oversight that I didn't put a snack bar in either of those cases.
Okay, and then the dialogue, the alert dialogue.
The alert dialogue's here.
Okay.
So if they say yes, then it goes down.
Okay. I got it.
And otherwise, I do nothing if they say no. So that's where that logic is for the adapter. And there's similar logic in this. If you go to the screen here, because I've got an edit button or a delete button. So let's talk about this detail screen here. So if I click on one of the notes, I'm going to go here. Kind of like we saw with the snapshot, and you can add a snapshot listener to monitor the list, monitor the query. We can do the same thing with the detail activity. So the detail activity is first of all, you take the node ID in for on create. So whatever node ID you pass through as an extra, we're going to go into on start, just like we needed to do on the note list activity. I'm going to get the database, and I want to say, rather than just saying notes DB collection notes, I'm going to say let's look for a specific note and register a snapshot listener for that. So this says, go ahead and get that particular document, and then I'm going to update the UI every time that document changes. So if there's an error, I'm just going to show the error, and that's a method down further. And if it does succeed, then we'll get that. Similar to how we saw in the note list, we said value.toObjects. That's because there was a list of notes coming back here. Because a query versus this is a single document, so it's value.toObject. Is everybody tracking? So if you've got a single note, you're going to say toObject. If you've got a list of objects, then it's going to be toObjects. So then if we have a note, okay, we'll just update the UI and we're good. And just like we saw with the list, if I were to go change this on the database, because I'm using the snapshot listener, this screen would just automatically update with the data. Any questions so far on reading the data? Pretty easy, right?
Yeah, this is pretty straightforward.
So, and you know, as I said, you got callbacks like you were familiar with in retrofit and volley, where you say, hey, when we get the data, then we do this. So it is asynchronous code, right? So we're, you know, doing this, starting this operation, and later we'll get the response in the callback. Let's look real quick at the edit activity. And then we can, I think that's the last thing in here that we needed to touch. So in terms of edit, I do have, you know, I need to get a few things. I need to get the user ID, so I'm getting that from the application. I need the node ID, and I'm getting that from the intent. And remember, I'm using the same activity for both add and edit. So if I go in here, I'm going to say, well, let's set the action bar to the thing it is, depending on, you know, either edit node or add node, depending on if we get a node ID. So if the node ID is not null, then the title of this screen will be edit node. If it is null, then it'll be add node. So if I go through here, the plus, it's add node. If I go through here, it's going to be edit node. Okay, so we start with that. The next thing that happens in onStart, and you've seen before that I've set up several of these things in onStart. I'm going to say, so if there is a node ID that's been provided, then we're going to go to the database. We're going to ask for that specific node. So in the notes collections, provide the node ID, and then I'm going to call get. And so remember, on the previous screens, I've used the add snapshot listener. And so I've done that because I want to get real-time updates as the document changes. The catch here, though, is when I'm talking about an edit screen, I don't actually want the data to change while I'm editing it. Does that make sense? Like, I want to get it once, and then I want the user to be able to apply edits in there. It'd be very weird if while they're editing the note, while they're editing the document, the screen refreshed on them and they lost their data. Does that make sense? So that's why on the edit screen, I'm not using a snapshot listener, because I don't want it to be real time. So if you want it to be real time, you use that add snapshot listener. If you don't want it to change dynamically, then you're going to use this get. Now here, this is completely optional. You don't have to provide this argument to get. But what I'm saying is where I want the source of that data to be. So that source to get, you can leave it as the default. So it'll be the default source. But there's actually 3 different values you can pass. You can pass default, you can pass cache, or you can pass server. And so if you pass cache, you're saying I only want the data to come from my local cached copy. Or if you say server, I only want it to come over the network. Okay. If you say default, then what it will try to do is it will try to see if the user is connected to the internet. And if they're connected to the internet, it will try to get it from the server. And possibly error out, versus cache, we'll say only get it from the cache. Now, why in this case might I want to get it from the cache rather than getting it from the network in terms of the edit screen? Why might I want to get that document from the cache?
If you get it, if it's updated in the database, say like on another device, or someone else is signed in, because it couldn't be anybody else because you have to authenticate, but your data would change while you may have edited, and that'd be frustrating.
Yeah, that's one for that. And the other part of things is how did I get here? how did I get to the edit screen? Well, there's two ways for me to get to the edit screen. I can get from it here, right? Or I can get from it here, right? Both of those two ways, notice that those screens, I've already had to download the note from the server, from the network. Does that make sense? So by the time I get to the edit screen, I know that that note has to have been cached. Does that make sense? There's no way for me to get into the edit screen without having previously cached the data. Following with me?
Not yet, no.
So there's no, look at what the screen is before it. The screen before it has the note. You see that?
Yeah.
This screen already downloaded it from the network and put it in the cache.
Okay, so you're just preventing another database call if you...
Right, because it would be completely unnecessary at this point to go back to the network because I'm going to have the same data as I already have. So I'm actually avoiding a network call here because it's actually unnecessary as well. Cool?
Yes.
So that's why I'm saying that the source has to be cache. So if it is successful, then I'm populating these two fields with the current note's title and body using very similar to what we saw. You know, I take the task that we get and I say toObject. That's very similar to what we saw on the previous screen. And if things fail, then I'm going to use the show error method. Now, this is a little bit weird. If you look in your Java quick reference that we looked at the very beginning of the semester, you'll see some discussion on this in terms of lambdas. But this is a shorthand when you say, I want to reuse a method that I've already written. So I've got several places in the edit activity where I want to show an error when something goes wrong. And so I don't want to have to duplicate that code every time I need to write that. Is everybody tracking with me there? So what I've done is I have this show error method here, just 2 lines. I say, you know, build up the message, and I'm using a string resource here I've got called generic error, and putting the error message in part of that. So I build up the message, and then I say let's show it in a snack bar. So those 2 lines of code, you know, I'm going to basically use those in a bunch of places. So it takes an error and it shows it in a snack bar. And so shorthand here, I'm saying this show error. Okay, so that's a shorthand to that method. Rather than writing it out as a lambda, I'm just calling that method directly. Cool. So you can do that when you have cases like this where otherwise you would have duplicated code in your error handlers. Anything else? Okay, so let's talk about the save. So we talked about what needs to happen in terms of getting the data to populate it initially. To save it, I'm going to hide the keyboard. I'm going to grab the 2 fields. So I've got a title and a body. Save those as local variables. I am doing some quick checking here, right? So I'm saying, well, the title and the body is required, right? So I'm going to say if the length is 0, well, okay, you haven't entered a title. We'll just tell you title is required. If the body is not entered, we're going to say body is required. You'll notice that there's return statements in here, just like we had earlier. Remember seeing those, Paul?
Oh, right, yeah, because we don't want to do the rest down there.
Same story, yeah. Same story. I don't want to do the rest of the code. So I'm just saying if the title is not there, we're done. If the body's not there, we're done. We don't need to do anything else. So let's get the database. Here I'm doing something interesting because I want to actually update it to, you know, I've got that created at field and updated at field. I want to track, you know, when the note was created as well as when it was updated. So I'm going to say field value dot server timestamp, and so that will give me a special thing which means that I can use that to update those fields, update those properties in the database to be now. So basically, you can think of this field value.server timestamp as gives you the current time. So I'm going to get that timestamp. I am going to then build up this hash map. So you can see the data type of a string to object. So that's what you actually need in terms of publishing data, both for adding a document or updating a document. So this is our data. And I want to say, hey, we want to update the title field to be whatever the user typed in. We want to update the body field to whatever the user, again, typed in. Updated at is going to be that server timestamp. And then I just need to, I need to do some differences depending on is this an add or is it an update. So I'm going to look is there a node ID, right? So if there is a node ID, then I know that I'm editing a node that already exists. If it's null, then I know I need to create a new node because that node doesn't exist yet. So in the case where I need to create a new node, I do actually need to add some additional fields. So I need to add the owner ID, owner UID. I need to know who owns the node. So I'm going to put that into my data map as well. And if I'm creating a node, again, I want to track when that's created. I don't want to update that timestamp. If I'm just updating a node, I just want to set that in this state, this case. So I'm adding those two additional fields that will be updated in the database. So in the case of update, I'm setting 3 fields, but in the case of add, I'm setting 5. So that's worth noting that that's happening here. So if it's an add, we're going to say, similar to things we've done previously, db.collection. We want to update a document in the notes collection. And I'm going to say add and provide the data, right, those fields that I want to be there on the new document that I'm inserting. So I provide that map, and then I just need to listen for, was it successful or failures. So if it succeeded, we're just going to finish the activity, go back to the previous activity, all good. And if something goes wrong, say maybe, maybe there's an issue with the network, maybe there's an issue with saving the data, maybe our security rules are violated, then we're going to show that error. And in the other case, let's say we want to edit a document. So I'm going to say collection notes, specify the document ID I want to update, so document node ID, and then we're going to say update with those values. So you'll notice here I haven't specified any sort of document ID, so by not specifying a document ID when I add it, that's how it just randomly gets a new random ID. So here I do specify the document ID. And I say update. So here we say add, here we say update. Other than that, it's basically the same thing. Questions?
Line 159, the double colon. What's the longhand look like? Is
longhand.
There a way to undo it, like to unravel it, so you can see it? That makes it easier to understand.
I would say it doesn't necessarily make it easier to understand, but the longhand would be error, arrow. I think I added an additional. Let me get this going back up. Show error. So if I was going to write this out longhand, that's what that would look like. But this actually and that are not exactly equivalent. Because here I have a function that calls show error. This is just directly calling show error. Okay. So this would be the rough equivalent of that.
Okay.
But it's not exactly the same in a performance sense because there's an additional function call if I'm writing it that way.
All right, I'll just accept it like it is. It just helps me understand what's going on. Otherwise, I'm just typing it. It works, but it's like, can I answer what's going on here?
Yeah, and it's what we call a function pointer, basically. It's we're basically passing this method, this show error method, as an argument.
Okay.
So we're passing a method as an argument is kind of how you can think about it, which is kind of the same thing that we're doing with a lambda. It's just that we, maybe this is code that we're not able to easily reuse. So I haven't written that as a method because it's kind of unique to that particular case. Questions?
Not at the moment.
So you can refer back to this. We've gone over full CRUD today. So you saw create, you saw read, you saw updates, you saw deletes. All of that's in this application, so you can see all the ways to do that. Those are things you can look and read up further in the documentation if you want to know more about it and how to kind of manipulate it. But I wanted to give you an example that showed you, here's what it looks like if you have users and user sign-ins and a full CRUD workup. Now, one thing I do want to mention, I do have some security rules on the back end. Okay, so remember in here my constraints on this database is that I only want my users to be able to update or read their own notes. Is everybody with me there? That's the goal for the rules. So what we're going to look at is what I have here as the rules. There's some outer stuff here that gets automatically generated. All we really care about is this one section here in the middle, is these 4 lines. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll kind of go over this. So first thing I'm saying match. So I say match notes/ID. So I'm saying let's match the notes collection. Okay, and the ID, this is with, I've got the curly braces, says any ID that you can come up with. So wherever the ID is, and that's actually going to get put into a variable named ID. So I'm saying this rule applies to all the notes in the notes collection. Cool? And then what we write is these lines that start with allow. So I'm going to say allow create if the following conditions are true. If the following conditions are true, then you can create a document. And then I'm saying allow read and write if these conditions are true. So if either one of these two conditions match, then you will be permitted to do the read or the write. Cool? So in terms of creating a document, well, you can only create documents if 2 things are true. You only create a document if you are logged in and if you own that. If the document you're creating, you will then own. So that's what I'm doing here. So I'm saying if the request.auth is not null, so that says if you're logged in, request.auth gives us about the user that's logged in. If that's not null, okay, that has to be true. You have to be logged in. And then request.auth.user ID, that gives the user ID that's trying to make the update, that's trying to create a record. We'll say that has to be equal to request.resource.data.owner ID. So this first part, request.resource.data, that refers to the document that is being inserted. So remember, we have this owner ID field on the document, and so I'm saying that has to match the ID that has to match the ID of the user who's making the change. Does that make sense? So I'm saying you have to be logged in, and the documents you create, you have to say that you are the owner of those. Does that make sense? So one of the things that means is if I were to take this one line out and I don't set the owner ID, this would fail because it doesn't pass my security rules. Or if I set it to a different user ID than what my user ID is, like I said, I'm going to set it to Corey's user ID, it wouldn't allow me to do that. I wouldn't be allowed to create a document in somebody else's name or in nobody's name. So that's why that first rule is there. Questions?
How did you come up with that? Is that just some boilerplate code that you just tailored a little bit?
I took some stuff from the documentation, and yeah, I tailored it from there.
Okay, is that like what the exception? Obviously, things like owner user ID and
yeah,
like that are specific. But other than that, it's
no. The only thing that's specific here is this Willow part. Owner ID. That's the name I came up. The rest of this is basically, that's like that's kind of what it's got to be, right? If it's something like I'm creating my own things, it's pretty much going to look that way almost universally.
Where did you find that? You said it's boilerplate, right? Just so we can know.
So if you look into the documentation for Android, for Firebase, I'll link it here. And I've also uploaded this, I believe, to Perusal as well. So there's a document here about the rules language and what that looks like, and it'll go through a lot of these details. So you can see that, and it'll give you some examples if you read further. Including if you look at security rules in Firebase authentication. I think that, no, that's not it. It's just this one. So security rules language, if you read through that article, that'll give you a lot of these examples.
Okay. Well, where specifically on there is it? Like, I'm just trying to, it seemed like you just changed one thing, so I'm just looking for that on there. So
I don't know. Let's see. Rate security rules. Oh, there we go. Basic security rules. So this other page here is going to give you a lot of examples of things that they have here. So, for instance, they say, yeah, there's a bunch of examples, and you can see what those look like. So I borrowed some stuff from those two pages, as well as just adapting it to my specific needs. So that's the first line. I'm saying this is conditions for creating. And then reading and writing is kind of a similar story. You have to be logged in, again, to read or write any data. And then I also want you to be only able to edit your own documents. So request.auth UID, again, is the current user, and I'm saying the owner ID, right? So the thing that you're manipulating has to be your own. Now, the thing I missed and the thing I need to update here is this should actually be in both cases. I shouldn't, otherwise you can change the owner to somebody else without that. So let me clean this up a little bit. So I will share this here. So that's how I've set up the security rules for this application. But I can guarantee you that your application will need different security rules. So you can take that as an example. But I think that you'll kind of need to figure out the security rules that make sense for your app. Cool.
All right. So the tailored part is that what's highlighted in gray.
Yeah. That's the part I had to write. The rest of that will already be in there. If you go to your rules section, the rest of that's automatically generated for you, assuming you started with the production ready mode. So more than likely, you're going to have data where some users can see it and other users can't see it, or maybe you can see everybody's data, but you can't update somebody else's data. So this may not work for you exactly. You'll have to kind of manipulate that again, to fit your needs. So because of that, and I do want to be able to see these rules, these rules are nowhere in your application code that you're submitting. I do need to be added to all of your Firebase projects. to see your security rules. Everybody tracking with me? Because I do need to see this part in terms of grading and testing your final projects. So let's see. Can I add project settings, users and permissions? Okay. So one of the things I'll need you to do is log into your Firebase account. To do this, log into your Firebase account. You're going to get to here, go to project settings, users and permissions. And what I need you to do is I need to add me as a member to your project.
Add you as a editor, viewer?
Editor. Yeah. So I'll have to go through my emails and accept all those invites, but I do need that in order to be able to.
You want us to use the email that you have right there?
Yeah, use prsmith@rankenit.com. How's today been as far as helpfulness in terms of learning Firebase?
I think this example is going to be very helpful to look back on and kind of figure out the paths to stuff and figuring out where everything is.
I figured it might be easier to see an example than troll through all the documentation, because I was looking through the documentation, it was kind of spread out, plus it's like, hey, some of it's like what language ever you're reading writing in, because it's like, is it Java, is it Android, is it is it JavaScript? So this has got all the Androidisms in it.
Yeah, I'm thinking just to get started with this and converting it over, adding a login screen. That one of the first things I want to do is what we were just looking at a few minutes ago is that JSON object or whatever with all the match and all that, what you highlighted in gray.
Okay.
That pretty much has to be the first step after you get your schema together, right?
Yeah, that's got to be very early in the process, because you need to define what our users are allowed to read and edit. So yeah, that's going to be pretty early in the process. One of the first things you need to do.
Do you have to accept the editor role, or does it just tell you that you've been added as one?
I believe I do, and I'll check my email here after we dismiss and follow up with anybody if I'm missing somebody. But I think that, I think I have to accept it. So once you've done that, once you've added me as an editor, what's left to do for today is I want you to go to Perusal. There's this series of videos that I want you to watch today or tonight. They're about 10-20 minutes a piece. They're relatively short, but that'll run you through a lot of the just general understandings of how to structure your database and querying and pricing and a lot of these. There's even a video here on security rules. So I'd ask you to watch through all of those today. We'll then talk about those. I can answer any questions about those. I think on Monday, will probably end up being.
For the points for perusal, do we just have to have 3 comments on any number? Like we can have 3 spread out amongst all the videos, or 3 per video?
Not per video, spread out. Spread out.
Okay.
I just don't have a way easy in Perusal to say like spread out. So I'll just have to manually crunch the grade numbers on those.
Okay.
But yeah, at least 3 comments spread out. You don't have to have 3 comments for video. That's a setting. I also have to set that broadly on Perusal. I can't set that on a per assignment basis. So.
What are we doing tomorrow? Because we're working on this tonight, all the perusal, and then we'll get to.
Yeah. So tomorrow, I expect you to. Tomorrow is going to be a lab day, so I don't expect to do any lecture tomorrow. Tomorrow, I just want you to take what we've learned today and yesterday, and start applying it to your final project. Cool.
Okay.
So you're going to take, there should be somewhere that we've already talked about in your final project where you need to do some CRUD and store user data or have a reason that users need to log in. So that's what I want you to get started on tomorrow is implementing login and implementing CRUD like we've talked about today into your final projects.